Hello, everyone. You're very welcome to our Wednesday installment of our higher webinars. Let us know as you join, maybe where in the world you're tuning in from. We have lots of folks joining globally, so I always love to see where in the world people are. But before we start, just to, I guess, give you a little bit of an overview of higher in case you're new here. So my name is Kelly McGrath-Smith. I am the Community Director at Higher, and we are a global community. We've got over 11,000 members at the moment, which is incredible. And we are growing day by day. Our community lives predominantly over on Slack. And we have lots of amazing conversations going on. We've got various sub-interest groups in there. There's always someone that you can connect with if you've got a challenge within internal HR or recruitment. So it's a really lovely place to be part of. On top of that, on top of our lovely Slack community, we also have in-person events. So we run breakfasts for leaders, we run dinners, we run virtual roundtables as well, so that you can join no matter where in the world you are. And then we also have these amazing weekly webinars that we host here for everyone on LinkedIn Live. And I guess if you are new-ish to us, maybe you don't know us, what I'll do is I'll just pop a little banner below. So if you head to hirehq.com, you will be able to sign up. And like I said, we are a global community for anyone who is working in internal talent acquisition or HR. So you can head to that lovely link below. And hopefully you might be able to see our lovely guest and our little banner here that's hopefully giving you a little bit of an overview in terms of what we are talking about today. So we're going to look at inclusive hiring, ways to minimize bias in the hiring process. And we're joined by Dani, who's an intentional DE&I consultant, who will deep dive into manual, tech, systematic ways that we can look to minimize bias in the process. This is definitely a topic that has been always in high demand from folks in the community. So we're absolutely thrilled to be able to have Dani here today. So what I'll do is I'll pass to Dani so she can give an introduction and let you all know a little bit more about her.
Oh my God, thank you so much. And I'm just like trying to pull up my slides, so let me know if y'all can see them. I know that tech takes maybe a minute or two, but Kelly, again, thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Hire, for creating this space for us. If we've never met before, I'm Dani Herrera. My pronouns are she and her in English and ella in Spanish. And among many, many other things, I'm a talent and D&I consultant, trainer, and speaker. And I'm also one of the founders at Allies in Recruiting and one of the members at the NASA D&I practitioners database. So, friends, we actually have a lot to cover today. So please go ahead and get comfy. Go grab your favorite snack, your favorite drink, your lunch, or just, sit back and take this full hour to yourself. We are going to learn a couple of new things, hopefully, today. And also a quick reminder that we created this session for you. So if you have any questions, any comments, any reactions, or any notes along the way, please drop them in the chat. I will do my best to read your thoughts as they come in, but if we can address them right away, we will make sure to tackle them in the Q&A portion of our conversation. All right, with all of that said, let's get going. I know I'm not breaking any news here, but the last few years were a lot for everybody. We all experienced a global pandemic, a D&I awakening, and several life impacting events. We collectively and individually experienced unprecedented levels of trauma and stress and anxiety. And talent teams and recruiters also went from being, and I know that you know this, went from being highly needed and required and sought after just to be part of ongoing massive layoffs just a few years later. And on top of everything that talent and recruitment professionals had to deal with at an individual and personal and professional level, They also had to learn how to work with remote and hybrid teams. They had to learn how to adapt to ever changing company cultures. They had to face job searches themselves, and they also had to learn how to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion on their day to day in a way that they've never done before. In short, recruiters and talent professionals had to learn how to revamp pretty much everything that they knew about being great recruiters with little to no support or training. And believe me, I hear you and I see you. I was a recruiter for a very, very long time. But here's the thing though, being a good recruiter is simply not enough. Because let's be honest, recruiting at its core, it is not hard, right? Like, yes, I know before you all start screaming at me in the comment section, I know that recruiting is and can be very hard and very stressful and anxiety inducing. But again, I was a recruiter for 17 years, so I know exactly what you all mean. But we have to admit that looking for candidates and sourcing and reading resumes and interviewing and writing feedback and partnering with business leads is something that all recruiters do, or we are learning to do if you're just getting started in your career. And on top of that, there are many, many platforms and processes and resources and events and communities just like this one that support our efforts. But leading intentionally inclusive, equitable, and accessible hiring processes, that is a completely different story, though. Because I think that we all know, or at least it is time that we start admitting that hiring and interviewing and recruiting, they have uninclusive, inequitable, and inaccessible by design for way too long. We've all been following inequitable practices since we started working as recruiters, probably. And we started doing that without even realizing, honestly. And listen, I get it. It is extremely rare that recruiters receive any training at all or receive any support at all. So basically, what we all end up doing is we start following each other's advice and suggestions, and we start copying best practices from a different company or from somebody else that we kind of admire or that we like. We also start copying ideas and systems and processes without stopping to think whether those practices are perpetuating discriminatory practices. And just like that, what we do is we pass on and we embed and we share and we institutionalize our own biases in the way that we work and in the way that other recruiters work and the way that interviewers work and in the way that hiring managers work, right? And that is exactly what I want to discuss with all of you today. If anything, I really want all of you to leave this conversation wanting to become more intentional recruiters, meaning recruiters that will do their absolute best to identify, minimize, and interrupt their own biases when showing up for work and honestly in life as well, outside of work. All right, so I want to pause here for a moment because I really, really want to hear from all of you. So, in the chat, go ahead and let me know when you think about biases in the hiring process or biases in the recruiting process, where do you think that those biases take place? I'm going to give you a couple of options and then you let me know in the chat. And I'm looking this way so I can read the chat as well. So, where do you think that they take place? Do they take place in the resume review or in the phone screen and interviewing stage or when we write feedback? Or do you think that maybe in none of these options, or do you think that they actually happen everywhere? I know that we have a few seconds of delay, and I want to give everybody a couple of, like seconds to think about your answer. So go ahead and let me know again. Where do you think that they take place? In the resume review, the phone screen, the writing feedback stage, none of those options, or everywhere? I'm starting to see a few private chats, like I'm getting like in the writing feedback stage, which yes, phone screen interviewing. Okay. Okay. So thank you. Thank you again for sharing those thoughts with me. I will admit this was a tricky question because biases do show up everywhere in the hiring process, literally everywhere at every single step of the way and multiple times on every single step of the way as well. In fact, there are over 200 biases that usually happen on any hiring process. Of course, we unfortunately don't have the time to cover all of those biases today, but I'm hoping that at least I can give you the tools that you will need to identify some of those biases moving forward. All right, so what you see here is an example of recruitment or hiring process. And again, before you all start yelling at me in the comment section, I know that a recruiting process or the hiring process is way longer and is way more complex than what you can see on screen. And also, every single company does things a little bit differently, and every single one of you might have a different level of seniority, and that means that you might have a different level of involvement during the process. But with that said, I want to bring our attention to the four main parts of the hiring process that we recruiters or talent professionals or HR professionals control and own. Because let's be honest, even if we wanted to build the most inclusive and most intentional and most equitable process out there, recruiters don't usually have the power or the proximity to power to change all the processes and systems that a company follows. And if you are an external recruiter, it is extremely likely that you have absolutely no say in the way that your clients work, right? But again, as recruiters, we absolutely can do our best to embed equitable and inclusive practices in the way that we work, in the way that we look for candidates, in the way that we interact with our candidates, the way that we read our resumes, the way that we interview, and the way that we write feedback. All right. So again, let's start with sourcing and all things candidate outreach. Because again, that's something that we all do. Like at the end of the day, one of the parts of our role is finding candidates, finding the candidates that we eventually want to hire. So here's the thing, minimizing biases in the way that we source for candidates and the way that we look for talent is something that we need to do before, during, and after we start looking for talent. Because many of the biases that we have will show up in the way that we write the job description and the way that we write the questions that we ask during the job application process, and also in the places that we decide to actually go ahead and start looking for talent. In short, interrupting biases before we even start reaching out to candidates is essential so as not to exclude any candidates from the running before they even have the chance to apply. And this is very, very important because, again, whenever we talk about sourcing, we usually think about, okay, we are just, like, gonna diversify our pool. So I'm gonna show you a couple of things that we can do. So, to unbiased, between a million air quotes, our job descriptions, we can actually start by using inclusive language. So I'm sure that you all heard the statistics that cover that women only apply to roles if they cover 100% of the skills mentioned in the job description, while men apply if they cover 50% of those skills. Unfortunately, again, we won't have the time to cover how biased language excludes talent from so many different historically excluded communities from the running. But please know that the more uninclusive the language in our job description is, the more talent we are excluding from the running before they get started with the process, before they even submit the resume. And yes, I know, again, recruiters don't usually write job descriptions, but we do post them, we do share them with candidates, and we do use job descriptions to inform what we are looking for and to inform the conversations that we are having with candidates, right? So it is our responsibility to make sure that they are as unbiased as possible. And one thing that it's also very important to remember is that inclusive language actually goes way beyond gender inclusive language. Inclusive language takes into consideration gender, age, neurodiversity, disabilities, socioeconomic status, and so much more. To help you get started, I recommend using tools like Textio or Gender Decoder or Joplin. These tools, what they do is they actually scan the language in your text. I mean, it could be on a job description or an email that you're trying to write, and they will give you recommendations on how to make your content a little bit more inclusive. There are many more tools out there, but those are the tools that I really like and the tools that I recommend. The second thing that we can do, as you can see on screen, is using plain language. If you've never heard about plain language before, let me tell you that plain language is basically using language that everybody will understand. With plain language, we are making sure that we are not letting our racial, class, education, and ability biases get in the way of the message that we are trying to convey. Again, it could be a job description or an email or an email that we are trying to send. So, to do that, a few things that you can start doing is limiting the amount of bullet points in your job descriptions. Avoid using too much jargon or industry specific language that only you or your industry understands. And start writing in shorter and friendlier sentences. And last but not least, and I know that I've mentioned this very briefly before, something that we should all be doing anyways is intentionally diversifying our talent pool. And I know that this sounds obvious, right? Because of course, like if we diversify our pool, it will help us achieve a more diverse candidate pipeline, sorry, and hopefully we will achieve a more diverse workforce. But here's the thing, when you diversify your pool, something that you're doing as well is you're helping interrupt some of the biases and stereotypes that your interviewers and hiring managers may as well. So, for example, imagine that your hiring manager is somehow convinced that there are no women in technology, and if you only submit male presenting candidates, what you're doing is you're perpetuating those stereotypes and biases that your hiring managers has. And in that case, what's going to happen is your hiring manager will continue thinking that way. And that person will eventually embed the rest of the hiring process, the rest of the hiring team, and the rest of the interviewers with the biases that they have. All right. So now that we've started to implement a more inclusive and equitable sourcing process, I want to start intentionally thinking about what happens in the resume stage because again friends, we do have a lot to learn about the resume stage. But before we even get to the resume review stage, go ahead and let me know in the chat as well. And again, how are we feeling so far? Are we moving too fast, too slow? Are we learning something new today? Just let me know. I'm just going to give it again a couple of seconds because I know that we have a little bit of a delay with the live audience today. So I'm just going to give it a second, but I would very much appreciate if you let me know how you're feeling so far. If we are moving too fast or too slow. I'm getting a couple of private messages, which is great. Thank you so much for that information and for your thoughts. Awesome. All right. So I'm getting messages of, I'm learning a couple of things that they've never thought about, like minimizing and interrupting biases and stereotypes in the way of whenever we share a more diverse pipeline, which is great. Awesome. All right. So let's keep going. All right. So before we start thinking about, the resume review stage, I want to take a few moments to talk about some of the biases that immediately and very quickly take place in our brain when we are reviewing a resume. Again, these are just a few examples. Tackling all of the biases that could show up on a resume would probably require, honestly, a full day of training. So let's do the best we can with the time that we have. So in this case, I wanted to show you what happens when you receive a resume that has been referred to you, or when you're reviewing a resume that your manager has reviewed before you did, or a resume that the hiring manager has already reviewed and approved before you had the chance to review it, right? So what happens in that case is immediately our brains decide that if our manager liked that person, probably you should too, right? So what we do is we immediately decide that because this person has worked in this case at Google, could be any other company, and in our mind we assume that this is like the best company to work out there. We assume and we believe that they should be interviewed. Again, we are letting some of our personal assumptions to dictate the way that we feel about this candidate. And on top of that, what we are also seeing here is that if they held that particular role in there, again, they're probably as great as this company. So we need to interview them, right? And as we keep on reading the resume, we also immediately decide that because this person went to Cambridge or an Ivy League school, they might be super smart. And obviously, we need to interview them, right? So those are the things that happen, again, very quickly and unconsciously in our mind whenever we receive a resume. And all of the biases that I just mentioned, again, they take place in seconds. And sometimes you don't even realize that they're actually happen. And they also happen all at once and directly influence our final decision. Again, we don't necessarily know that they're happening, right? So what do we do if we want to minimize biases when reading, reviewing, and sharing resumes with the rest of the interview panel? So, the very first thing, and I know that this sounds obvious, but the very first thing that I need to ask you all to do is to pause and review the resume. In case that you didn't know, biases are shortcuts, so they exist to help us make more and faster decisions. They also tend to happen when we are not, like fully paying attention to what we are doing and whenever we are moving too quickly. So, the best way to minimize those biases is to actually take the time we need to read, review, and analyze the information that you have in front of you. I know that's not easy to do, especially as recruiters. We have hundreds of resumes to go through. But again, whenever we don't do that, we risk making the wrong decision between a million air quotes. And once you've paused and reviewed the information that you have in front of you, it is extremely important that you question your assumptions. And that means, like, when you're reading that information, like, did we decide not to move forward with a candidate based on their name? Or have we decided to move forward with this candidate only because they worked at XYZ company and we believe that XYZ company is the best company out there? Or that we decide to move forward with them because they have the same hobby as we do. So, again, it is extremely important that we ask ourselves those questions before making a decision. And lastly, when we are reviewing resumes, we absolutely must intentionally and continuously challenge stereotypes. So again, we need to start asking ourselves, like, have we really decided not to move forward with a candidate because they went to community college instead of an Ivy League school? Or have we intentionally or unintentionally only presented female candidates for an admin or a receptionist role? Or have we, let me think about something else, have we automatically discarded any resumes with a name that it's hard for us to pronounce? In this case, you will all need to do a little bit of soul searching for this type of work. I can only guide you through it and I can guide you through the process, but I cannot do the actual work for you here. All right. So again, as of now, we've done our work to minimize biases in our job descriptions, in our communications, in our resume reviews. So that means if we follow the process that we were reviewing at the very beginning of our call, that means that now we have a pipeline of candidates that we would like to reach out to, and we would need to contact them in a way. So if you are multitasking, please come back to me for a moment because I want to chat with you in the chat or the comment section. So as a recruiter, whenever you need to contact someone and you need to screen them, let me know, what do you think, like what type of recruiting screen or recruiting contact is the best way or the best screen to minimize biases? And again, I'm going to give you a couple of options. So is it phone screens? Is it video screens? Is it in-person screens or interviews? Or is it something that you've never really thought about before? So again, the question is, what type of recruiting screens is the best to minimize biases? And the options are phone screens, video screens, in-person screens, or the last option, maybe this is something that you've never really thought about. I'm gonna again give you a couple of seconds because I know that we have a little bit of delay. So I'm just, like play the waiting music in my mind while I wait for you and while I read the private comments that I get my way. So I'm getting a few comments saying that this is something that I've never thought about before, which is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts with me. And again, I'm looking this way because this is where I have the questions coming in. Awesome. All right. So I have Tanya mentioning that phone screens minimize biases of someone appearance, home, or quality. And I can't see the entire comment, but mentioning that phone screens. All right. So thank you again for everyone that was sharing their thoughts with me. And I might break a few hearts here. So it is extremely common for recruiters and talent professionals and HR professionals to believe that phone screens are best. Because again, after all, we cannot see the person. So if we can't see them, that must mean that we are making an unbiased decision, right? Because we can't make a decision based on the way that they look or the color of their skin or a million other things. But what would you say if I told you that that's not necessarily true? So here's the thing: when and if we only offer phone screens as an option, we are excluding candidates before they even had the chance to interview with us. So let me tell you what I mean. Phone screens are great and they can be great, but they actually exclude people with disabilities, people who might have a foreign accent, people who would benefit from reading subtitles, people who process information differently, people who might need to read lips, or maybe someone who's using a hearing aid, someone that might need to have an ASL interpreter for that conversation, and so many, many more. So, my best piece of advice here is to always, always, always ask the candidate what works for them. Start thinking about the candidate first instead of thinking about what we are used to doing, right? And what is comfortable for us as recruiters. And once you have done that, let's think about some easy to implement actions we can take to minimize even more biases along the way. So imagine that your candidate says that they prefer doing video interviews, right? In that case, please make sure that you are offering both the candidate and the interview panel the opportunity to use a neutral Zoom background or whatever video platform you're using, like a neutral Zoom background, because they help you minimize affinity biases during the conversation. And as you move forward with the interview, please be mindful of the questions that you ask. Of course, don't ask any personal questions that could lead to more affinity bias or confirmation biases or the halo or horn effect. So I know that sometimes, of course, as recruiters, we want to make sure that we make the candidate feel more comfortable and that we are, like breaking the ice. So we might say something like, what is your superpower? Or what do you like doing in your free time? And whenever we do those things, we are immediately opening the door for dozens of biases as well. Now, I'm not saying stop asking those questions. What I'm saying is be mindful of the questions that you ask and be mindful of the biases that you may have when the candidate answers those questions. And lastly, I would love to ask you all to be a little bit more mindful and present during your interviews and actually respect the candidate's silences and follow up questions. As I briefly mentioned before, not everybody processes information in the same way, right? Some people might actually need to think and gather themselves before answering the question that you asked. Some might need a minute to actually remember the answer because we don't remember every single thing that we've done in our entire lives all the time. And some might be even looking for the right word in this language to answer, especially as someone like me, I speak English as a second language, right? So sometimes my brain does this weird thing. I don't remember words in Spanish or English, or I remember them in Spanish and not in English. So I might need maybe a few more seconds to gather myself and answer something. And something else that might happen is some people might not fully understand the question and might need clarification. None of the things that I mentioned before are an indication of lack of skills, experience, or expertise. All right, so I know that I've been throwing a lot of information at you. There's been a lot. But as we talked about at the very beginning, my intention for today is that we all learn to recognize how we have embedded some of the biases that we have, how we embedded them in the way that we work, in the way that we train others, in the way that I interview, and the way that we read resumes and all of that. And honestly, that takes, time, commitment, effort, and patience. So as we approach the end of the process that the recruiters own, again, I really want to pause here again for a couple of seconds and really hone in the way that we write feedback, because what we write in our notes will positively or negatively influence the hiring manager's decision. So when writing your interview notes, and probably you've heard this before, but again, if you're multitasking, please come back to me because this is very, very important. When writing your interview notes, I have to ask you to write your feedback immediately. The reason for this is research shows that we forget about 50% of a conversation after just 1 hour. After a day, we forget more than 70% of whatever happened in that conversation. And after a couple of days, we forget 90% of whatever happened in that conversation. So whenever we let that happen, whenever we let ourselves forget of the actual facts and the information that we shared in the interview or the conversation that we had, what happens is our brains tend to fill in the gaps with our impressions, our stereotypes, our biases, and our feelings. So again, put yourself in your recruiting task and role for a moment. So imagine what would happen if you actually interview a candidate that you or your company would consider, between a million air quotes, diverse. And you write your feedback after a couple of days. What do you think that your notes would actually say if you're not necessarily used to interview someone like the person that you just interviewed? And you've identified that you have some stereotypes that might negatively impact that person. And as you're doing that exercise, how would they compare to a non diverse candidate, between a million air quotes? So once you've written your feedback, And before sharing it with the hiring manager, I want to ask you to please again take a few moments to pause, read, and reread your notes to identify any potential bias language in the same way that we did at the very beginning of the process when we were writing, like our job description and their communications that we were putting together for our candidates, right? And as it's very similar, you can even use the same tools that you used for the job description phase. So you can use like Textio and Jotlint and Gender Decoder and all of those other tools. Doing this, like pausing, reviewing, rereading, and making sure that your language is as unbiased as possible will help you edit bias language, identify any negative stereotypes that you might have included without even realizing. It might actually help you identify any positive biases that you've included in your notes as well. And it will help you rewrite, if needed, your sentences using plain language in a way that your hiring manager will fully understand, no matter if there is an age gap between you and the hiring manager, if the hiring manager speaks a different language that you do, and again, all of those things that we were talking about when we talked about the plain language. All right, friends. So if you all learn one thing from me today, let it be this: biases cannot be fully eliminated, but they can be minimized and interrupted. We just need to be very, very intentional about our efforts. And as you probably realized, that is something that we need to do continuously throughout the interview process, every single step of the way. And when we do that, we'll start identifying some of those very outdated and stereotyped and biased systems that we've been following without even noticing. And that is the very first step to creating a more inclusive, equitable, and intentional recruitment practice. All right, friends, thank you so much for joining me today. I do hope that you all learned a couple of things today. If you enjoyed this session, please send me a quick note on LinkedIn. I really enjoy learning and knowing what you all think. And I really want to hear your thoughts as well. And if you would like to work one on one with me, or if you would like me to come in and run a training session at your company or your teams, please reach out as well. I'm already booking sessions for Q1 and Q2 in 2024. I have all of my details there on screen, and I want to tackle all of your questions now. And I'm just gonna call back my friends at Hire. Hi, Kelly.
Hello. That was amazing. And what I love about these webinars is this will also be available as a watch back and a replay. So I think folks can kind of go back and digest things at another point as well. But yeah, as
Yeah.
you said, please pop any questions in the chat for Dani while we're here. One thing that I would love to ask you, if that's okay, while we wait for any other questions,
Yeah.
was just around your piece around bias within the phone interview stage.
Yeah.
And maybe is there anything you can share in terms of like, people watching, how they may be able to, minimize that bias if they are doing phone screens? Because I think a lot of companies, it's sometimes mandated that, look, this is the process at this point. So any kind of
Yeah.
tips or guidance that you might be able to share?
Yeah, so that is actually a very important question. And that is also one of the reasons why I make a point to always talking about phone screens, because I understand like some companies are still pushing for phone screens. And in an ideal world, we would be able to have this conversation and explain to our managers or the hiring manager, like, hey, you know what, like phone screens, it's the way that we've always done things, but they're not necessarily equitable or accessible, right? But if that is the case, if the company's still pushing for phone screens, there are a couple of things that we can still do. One of the things that we can do is, first and foremost, instead of just going ahead and scheduling the phone screen like right away, making sure that we are communicating with the candidate, like, hey, you know what, like in this company, the very first stage is a phone screen. Is there anything that I can do to make this conversation more successful or more comfortable for you? And the candidate will let us know whether they might need a reasonable accommodation for that conversation. And that's something that we will need to work on and we will need to adapt, right? Something else that we can do is making sure, again, that we are putting the candidate first and that we are asking the candidate what time works best for them instead of just like pushing whatever time works for the recruiter. Because again, like some people may have like other responsibilities. They might be at work, they might be working parents, so they just cannot pop into a phone screen at any given time of the day. And something else that we can potentially do is, if the company is still very poised in the idea of a phone screen because you cannot see the candidate, and in that way you would, between the millionaire codes, minimizing some of the biases that you could potentially see, and imagining that maybe the candidate needs to read subtitles, maybe something that we can do is offer a video call but with the cameras off. So it
Mm.
would be pretty much like the same thing as a phone screen, but we would still be offering the opportunity to the candidate to read subtitles in this case. Again, we would need to tackle this like case by case, especially if the company is really, really pushing for only doing phone screens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said there and kind of earlier on again about, start putting the candidate first, because I think sometimes it
Yeah,
can be very easy to just get into a cycle of, oh, this is my job, this is what suits me, these are my timings, but actually, putting yourself in the shoes of a candidate. And like I said, asking the question, how do you like to be communicated to? And I think I had an interesting conversation with someone recently. It was around candidate experience, and we were talking about the rejection process and how it really varies. Sometimes, someone will just call someone, reject them on a phone call. Sometimes they're rejected on a video call.
yeah,
And that can be really jarring depending on how someone likes to
100%.
communicate, how they like to receive really big information, especially rejections at the moment, which are, we're in an industry which has been really, really badly affected in the last year. So, like you said, if you're asking someone, how would you like to receive this information? And sometimes, they can read it and then schedule a call after
Yeah.
to ask those questions.
100%. And that's something that I usually always recommend as well, to include that question in like the application
Mm.
form that we have. And I know, right, like recruiters, they tend to have like a million things on their plate, but adding that question into the application process,
Mm.
it makes the communication and the rest of the interview process way easier for everybody, right? And then we will do our best to accommodate, right? Because if we do have someone that mentions that they prefer having every single piece of conversation over the phone, that can get tricky, right? Because some things might need to be communicated over email, like especially when we are trying to schedule something, right? Like it's way easier to schedule over email than over the phone. So again, making sure that we are communicating openly and transparently with the candidate and letting them know what's doable, what's not, and of course taking into consideration what is a reasonable accommodation and what
Mm.
isn't.
And I guess on a similar vein, when we look at video interviews, and
Yeah,
I would say a lot of people can probably relate in terms of whether you're a candidate or recruiter. Since COVID, a lot of the phone screens have just been replaced with video calls. Kind
yeah.
of straight up, you jump straight into a video call. Is there anything, similar to phone screens that folks can do when it comes to, if you're straight up jumping into a video interview, how maybe you can minimize bias on that side as well?
Yeah. So one of the things that I strongly recommend, and I know that I mentioned this like very briefly during the presentation, is including or adding like neutral backgrounds in the back, or like blurring the background, and
Mm.
there is like a lot of pros and cons to that, so I'm gonna like tackle them like as quickly as I possibly can. So the reason why I suggest having like a blurred background or a neutral background is because they help us minimize affinity bias. And what that means is, whenever we are minimizing some of the distractions, between a millionaire quotes, that we see behind the candidate, we prevent our brains to start making like random assumptions, right? Like in my case, like for example, you might see that I have plants, and if you also like plants, you might make an assumption, and okay, so we might have like a lot of things in common. Or I don't know, like maybe you don't really like plants, and you assume like, okay, Danny's gonna take like her entire day and like taking care of her plants, and she's not gonna take care of the work that we need to do. So whenever we, block that, we are helping minimize those affinity bias. The one thing that I need everybody to keep in mind, and again, this is like a conversation piece between recruiter and candidate, is especially if we are talking with a candidate that has a disability. This is like a very large umbrella term, but let's just leave it as maybe someone that has a disability. This backgrounds, they're still not as great. So what happens if you're talking to someone that might need to either again read lips or communicates with ASL? What happens is whenever you move, like you might see that those backgrounds, they tend to like minimize your movements as well. So you might not see the person as clearly as you might need them, right? So that is also a conversation piece. You might need to ask the candidate, like, hey, this is something that we do. We do this to minimize affinity bias. Does that work for you? And making sure that we are not, blocking communication instead of making it easier for everybody.
Amazing, thank you. And then we just have a question, probably
Yeah.
more from Tanya. So Tanya has asked, my client is building their first DEI recruitment strategy. Are there specific areas you recommend to consider implementing as that first step?
Yeah, so I love this question, and this is actually one of the things that I do for a living. So yes, I have a lot of thoughts. One of the things that I would say is a lot of companies, what they do is they jump directly into trying to attract or hire diverse talent, between a million air quotes. And I get that, right? Because that is the ultimate goal, to be able to hire the diverse talent. However, if we don't really pay a lot of attention to, again, to all of the steps that we were talking about before, we don't make sure that the questions that we are asking are inclusive, if we are not attracting the talent, if we are not making sure that our application process is accessible and equitable, all of that diverse talent that we are trying to attract and interview and hire is probably not going to make it through the interview process. And if they do, get an offer, there are a few things that might happen. They may not get an equitable offer, or if they do, they might actually leave the company very quickly, again, between a million air quotes, because the company hasn't started working on building an inclusive and equitable culture. So this is one of those things that we need to start tackling like before, during, and after. So I would strongly, strongly recommend, if this is something that you are all doing, as you start reaching out to diverse talent, start looking into the processes and the systems that you have so you can make sure that they're inclusive and equitable. And you don't have to, I mean, hopefully and ideally you can tackle the entire process, but if you can't, like tackle it in different steps as I showed you today. Like take a look at the questions that you're asking, break them down a little bit. Are they inclusive? Are they equitable? Are they accessible? And once you've reviewed that, you can move on to the next stage.
Amazing. I hope that was helpful, Tanya. Dani, thank you so much for today. This was
Yeah.
really, really insightful. It's been amazing having you join us. Like I said, this will be available on a replay, so feel free, anyone who's tuned in, share it with your colleagues. This is something that, we can all continue to learn from. And Dani,
Yeah.
hopefully we will maybe have you back again. We can chat,
Hopefully,
ever
yeah.
evolving, things will change. It's something that we always want to tune into moving forwards as well. So thank you so much. For anyone joining, if you're not part of our lovely hire community, feel free to head on over. We can kind of continue this conversation within the Slack group as well. We've got dedicated channels to discuss DEIB in there as well. So, please do come and join us. We know sometimes it can be a bit lonely working in internal TA and HR, especially if you're in a standalone role, or maybe it's your first time kind of leading or managing a team and you don't really have peers to talk to. So if you come and join us, there'll be lots of people for you to chat with, sense check things, and hopefully join us on some of our in-person and virtual events as well. Before we leave you go, I just wanted to share the webinar that we'll be talking about next week. So we've got Luke from Clio joining us, and we're going to be discussing all things progression plans and how to have effective one-on-one meetings as well. So hopefully see more of you then. As always, thank you for joining us. And if you've got any questions, you can drop a comment underneath this webinar if you're watching on LinkedIn Live, and myself and Dani will be able to pick it up as well. Thank you so much, Dani. See you later, everyone. Bye.
Bye.